Every legend has a mysterious event that transformed Michael Jordan's life. Not when he nailed the 1998 NBA Finals winning shot, not even after he became the greatest basketball player. He failed and one person saw past it. Utah's Delta Center hosted 1998 NBA Finals Game 6. Michael Jordan may play his last game. The audience is noisy, the pressure is high, and everything is familiar until him seeing her. The teacher who discovered him weeping in her classroom after being cut from the varsity squad, and told him that sometimes the worst failures lead to the greatest victories. Mrs. is in section 13, row 22. His geometry teacher, Thompson. She has something she gave him on graduation day that he never opened. What follows will make you believe in a teacher who recognized potential in a child who couldn't make his high school basketball team. Michael Jordan changed his red and black Air Jordan laces tonight and thought the Delta Center lights were brighter than normal. Bulls vs. Jazz 1998 NBA Finals Game 6. One more win would secure their sixth title. Michael had played many huge games, but this one seemed different. It may have been because everyone said it would be his last game. It may be because the Utah audience was louder than any he'd heard. Perhaps it was the peculiar sense he couldn't shake being watched. He was constantly monitored. You did that as Michael Jordan, but this was different. This seemed intimate, like someone was seeing through him past the jersey and stardom to his true self. Muscle memory took control during his warm-up dribble, crossover, jump shot, spin move, fade away. Every motion was flawless, practiced a million times. The ball flew as she had instructed him, arcing across the air. The feeling of being watched returned. His pulse raced as he approached section 113. Time stopped briefly. Rowdy crowd, flashing lights and sneakers squeaking on hardwood fading. He saw a face he hadn't seen in 20 years in row 22. A face that took him back to Emily A. Laney High School room 234. Yo MJ, Scottie Pippen jolted him awake. You good? While nodding, Michael's mind raced. She couldn't be. Would it? He attempted to look again after all these years, but the sea of faces was hazy. He said, just got lost in thought for a minute, smiling. His hands shook slightly as he cleaned his shorts. The squad had their final pre-game huddle under Phil Jackson. Michael remained thinking about section 113 despite his coach's instructions. The team's game plan, defense and plays appeared remote now. He couldn't stop thinking about her face, those compassionate eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and how she said, mathematics, Mr. Jordan is everywhere, even in basketball. Buzzer sounded. It was game time. Michael was extremely apprehensive as he took his court position. Sweaty palms, his heart sped up. He wasn't like this. He was Michael Jordan. He wasn't anxious. He unnerved others. The referee put the ball up for the first tip. Time to ignore everything and be Michael Jordan, everyone anticipated. He received the ball at the top of the key on his first possession. He'd shot this 1,000 times. Something felt wrong when he released the ball. The angle was off. Clang. Ball bounced off rim. Shake it off, he mentally said. His following shot also missed. 3 consecutive missed shots followed. The audience became louder. He heard whispers. What was wrong with Jordan tonight? He couldn't resist during a break for play. Looked back at section 113, row 22. This time he knew, though his gray hair looked different and 20 years had passed, his eyes, the same ones that saw something in him as a disappointed sophomore cut from the varsity team, were the same. Mrs. Thompson, his geometry instructor, changed everything. He left the Utah Delta Center unexpectedly. He was back in that high school hallway, holding a piece of paper that had crushed his dreams, fighting back tears as he heard the varsity coach say, "You're just not ready, Michael." He didn't know it then, but that failure would lead him to room 234, where Mrs. Thompson would teach him something more important than geometry. He returned to reality with the referee's whistle, prepared to defend against John Stockton. His mind raced. Why was she here? Why now? What made him feel like a sophomore again seeing her? Michael thought time was stretching backward to when this narrative began, when a geometry instructor recognized something in a broken-hearted youngster no one else saw. Michael scarcely saw Karl Malone carrying the ball down the floor. All he could think of was Mrs. Thompson's parting words. Sometimes, Mr. Jordan, the most important angles in life aren't the ones you can measure with a protractor. Her meaning eluded him then. His discovery was imminent. The audience cheered after he missed his fourth shot. Jordan was terrified for the first time in his career, not of losing the game but of disappointing the one person who believed in him before he was Michael Jordan. As Phil Jackson called a timeout, Michael looked at section 113 again. Mrs. Thompson watched him with the same patient grin she had 20 years before, when she discovered him weeping in her classroom after being cut from the squad. Michael felt this game will change his life again, just like that day. Michael heard the Delta Center quieten as he approached the Bulls bench. He remembered that fall afternoon in 1978 when everything changed. He could still smell Laney High's fresh floor wax and feel the roughness of that one piece of paper in his quivering hands, the varsity roster, the one without his name. Michael Jordan, sophomore, 5'10", guard cut. He read those words at least 20 times hoping they'd change. They didn't. His fingers crumpled the paper's edges as he stood there trying to hold back tears that wouldn't listen. The worst part wasn't getting cut. The worst part was knowing his older brother Larry had made varsity last year. Everybody said Larry was the family's real athlete. Some youngster patted his shoulder and said, "Hey, at least you tried," as he passed. Michael wanted to disappear. Basketball tryouts were over, and most youngsters went home. Michael could not go home. Not yet, not like this. He walked to room 234 without thinking. The door was open as usual. Mrs. Thompson graded papers with her red pen at her desk. Michael knew she heard him come in even though she didn't look up. She always knew who needed her. "Mr. Jordan," she murmured. "Mr. Jordan," she murmured, looking up from her wire-rimmed spectacles. "I didn't expect to see you this afternoon. I thought basketball tryouts were today." The first tear fell. He attempted to erase it fast, but Mrs. Thompson saw everything. She always did. "Close the door," she whispered gently, dropping her red pen. Michael did as she requested and stood awkwardly with the crumpled roster. Mrs. Thompson remained silent. She let him find his voice by waiting. "I didn't make it," he said. "Ah," she said, as if he'd solved her geometry issue. "And you think this is the end of your story?" He was surprised by the question. He anticipated sympathy or pity, but Mrs. Thompson never delivered. That set her apart from other teachers. Michael remarked, "Coach said I'm not tall enough," his voice shaking. "Said I'm not ready for varsity." Mrs. Thompson rose up and went to the whiteboard with geometric forms from that day's lesson. She drew a flawless circle with chalk. "Tell me, Mr. Jordan, what do you see?" Michael looked at the circle, bewildered. It's just a circle, is it?" she said, drawing a middle line. "Now what do you see?" "A circle cut in half." "Exactly," she said, chalk dust on her fingers, facing him. "But notice something, Mr. Jordan. Even though I cut this circle, it's still a circle. The cut didn't destroy it. It just gave us a new way to look at it." She approached him and carefully removed the crumpled roster from his hands, smoothing it on her desk. "Sometimes in life, Mr. Jordan, we focus so much on what we think should happen, we miss what could happen instead." Michael's eyes widened when she produced a basketball from her desk drawer. "Did you know that basketball is all about geometry?" she caught after bouncing. "Every shot you take creates an arc. Every move you make forms an angle. Even the court itself is one big geometric puzzle." Michael wiped his eyes, interested despite his grief. "What do you mean?" "Come early tomorrow morning," she replied, storing the ball. 6 a.m., before anyone else gets here. I'll show you." But tomorrow's Saturday." She said, "Yes, it is," with her knowing smile. "And you have a choice to make, Mr. Jordan. You can let this cut define you, or you can let it refine you. Which will it be?" Before he could respond, she said, Sometimes our biggest failures lead to our greatest victories. Michael was jolted back to 1998 by Phil Jackson's voice. You ready to go back in? Michael glanced at his coach before returning to section 113. Mrs. Thompson watched as she did every morning at 6 a.m. for 2 years. Nobody knew, and he never told anybody, that those early morning practices weren't simply about basketball. They were about something greater, which he was only now realizing. Yeah, coach, he stood. I'm ready. Michael felt different when he returned to the court. He felt the same way he had 20 years ago, stepping inside room 234 at 6 a.m. without the anxious energy. The morning after cutting, he checked the scoreboard. The Bulls trailed 12. Shot wasn't dropping. The Jazz fans went bananas. Michael Jordan's hidden weapon in the stands was the same one he had 20 years earlier, when a geometry instructor taught him that sometimes the greatest way to overcome a barrier wasn't to walk through it, but to take a fresh approach. As he positioned himself, he heard Mrs. Thompson's words clearly. Remember, Mr. Jordan, it's all about the angles. The ball came his way, and Michael grinned. It was time to demonstrate what a mathematics instructor had taught him about flawless shots. Michael arrived in room 234 at 5:55 a.m. the morning after being cut. He discovered Mrs. Thompson with the basketball from yesterday on her desk, along with graph paper and protractors. Good morning, Mr. Jordan, she stated without glancing up from her paper. Punctuality, that's the first lesson. The gym was shut at that time, so Mrs. Thompson took him to the outside court behind the school. The chilly morning air made their breath form clouds in the early light. Before you touch this ball, she began, holding out the basketball. I want you to do something for me. It was graph paper and a pencil. Draw the court. Every line, every angle, every dimension. Michael looked at her confused. But I thought we were going to practice shooting. Again we are. That knowing smile. But first you need to understand your workspace. You're in my geometry class, Mr. Jordan. Everything we do here will have a purpose. Trust the process. Drawing the court, he measured and marked every line. After he completed, Mrs. Thompson marked his drawing with a red pen she used to evaluate papers. The free throw line is 15 feet from the backboard stated. The three-point line is 23 feet 9 inches. The key is 16 feet wide. She regarded him. Numbers don't lie, Mr. Jordan. They tell us exactly where we stand. First morning, they didn't touch the basketball. Mrs. Thompson made him calculate angles. How many degrees was the crucial corner? From the top of the key, what was the wing shot angle? Michael became agitated as the sun rose. Mrs. Thompson, how is this going to help me make the team? She adjusted her glasses and pointed to his drawing. Tell me, what's the shortest distance between any 2 points? A straight line, he said instinctively. It was one of their first geometry lessons. Exactly, but in basketball, can you always take the straight line path to the basket? Michael considered the tryout defenders who blocked his shots. No. So what do you do instead? You find another way around. Find another angle, she said. And that, Mr. Jordan, is what we're going to master. Michael dribbled at the top of the key in 1998. Karl Malone guarded him, but Michael didn't notice him. He was seeing angles like Mrs. Thompson taught him. Michael calculated as his teammates got into position, and the play time was ticking down. This basket was 10 feet tall. He stood 20 feet away. Remembering Mrs. Thompson's words, Malone whispered, the ideal arc. He was 6'9", 37 degrees. Mrs. Thompson taught him about parabolas by having him shoot hundreds of free throws and track their arcs. She explained velocity using bounce passes and force vectors using chest passes. Every basketball move had a mathematical twin, set to be numbered. Numbers don't lie, she'd say after each session, showing him the calculator. She was right. His shooting percent, passes and dribbling, increased week after he mastered ball bounce angles. 2 decades later, Michael faked left and saw Malone's center of gravity move as he predicted. The defender's weight was at a 45 degrees angle too steep to recover fast. Mrs. Thompson had taught him that too. Your body can only move as rapidly as physics permits, she said one morning, chalking force diagrams on the outside court. Once someone leans past 45 degrees, they need at least half a second to recover. That's your window. He spun right as he had thousands of times on that outdoor court, but this time he could almost see Mrs. Thompson's geometric patterns glowing on the hardwood like neon lines. The other players became points on a graph, the court became a coordinate plane, and the basket was just the end point of a perfect parabola waiting to be drawn. As he rose for the shot, he saw Mrs. Thompson in the stands holding something that made his heart skip a beat, a yellowed piece of paper folded into precise triangles, the same paper she'd given him on graduation day, and which he'd never opened. Sometimes, she added that day, the most valuable lessons take years to understand. As the ball left his hands at exactly 37 degrees, time seemed to slow down, and Michael realized what Mrs. Thompson had been teaching him all along. It wasn't about basketball or mathematics, but something larger. Michael knew what would happen as the ball reached the top of its arc. Numbers don't lie. The ball swished into the net perfectly, just as Mrs. Thompson prophesied 20 years before. Michael returned to the present as the crowd roared, but his mind was already rushing back to another prediction she'd made, and the day she showed him his signature move. After 3 months of morning sessions, winter had arrived, and the outside court was too frozen to use. Mrs. Thompson had convinced the janitor to give her a gym key. Today, she continued, opening the huge doors, we're going to create something new. They proceeded to center court, where Mrs. Thompson had set up her graph paper, protractor, and red pen. The empty gym smelled of floor polish and possibilities. Mr. Jordan, she said, what's your biggest court weakness? Michael thought the bigger players can block my shots. Exactly. She grinned that wonderful smile that signaled she was ready to alter everything. So let's solve that problem, not with more power, but with mathematics. He'd never forget her sketch on a new sheet of graph paper. What if she'd say, drawing lines and angles, you could build a shot that was practically difficult to block. Shot that exploited defender height. Young Michael leaned closer, curious. How? By adjusting the angle of attack, she showed with a pencil. Lean back slightly instead of aiming straight up. Backing up creates space as the defender's momentum propels them forward. Michael frowned. Wouldn't that skew the shot? Only if you don't compute the right angle of release. She marked the page again. We must account for backward motion, release point, and ball. The problem is complicated, but if you solve it, she gave him the ball. Push off your rear foot at 45 degrees. Then back to make a 70 degrees angle with the floor, and release the ball at 110 degrees. He missed the first 20 shots since it seemed strange and unnatural. Keep going, she said. Feel the mathematics. After 100 attempts, the ball arced precisely and dropped past the net without a ripple. That, Mrs. Thompson boasted, is your fadeaway. Michael watched as John Stockton brought the ball up the court. The Jazz were still leading, but his shot had brought them within 7 points. In the stands, Mrs. Thompson was writing something in a small notebook, just like she did during their morning sessions. Every shot move, success and failure. Promise me something, she urged one morning after he beat the fadeaway. Promise me you'll remember that life has an equation, every issue has a fix. Just approach it from the appropriate angle. Young Michael had promised, but he'd also made a promise to himself. The day she missed their morning session for the first time, he'd arrived at 5:55 a.m., as usual, but the gym was locked, and Mrs. Thompson wasn't there. She'd never been late before. When he saw her later that day in geometry class, her face was paler, and her hands shaky as she wrote on the chalkboard.
Just a doctor's appointment, she responded when he inquired, but her grin hadn't reached her eyes. That afternoon, he overheard two teachers in the corridor discuss Mrs. Thompson and the term cancer, which made his blood run cold. He came to the gym at 5:30 a.m. the next morning to show her how much their workouts mattered. He practiced the fadeaway over and again, making each shot better than the previous. When she arrived at 5:55, her eyes were red but her voice was steady. "Show me," she said. He did the fadeaway just as she showed him perfect angle arc and splashed through the net. She wrote something in her notebook, tore it out, and folded it into triangles. One day, she remarked, clutching the folded paper, "This shot will signify more than 2 game points. It's too soon for you." In the stands 20 years later, Michael saw her hold up the same paper she gave him at graduation, which he never opened. Michael defended as Stockton passed the ball to Malone. His mind raced. What was on that paper? Why had she kept it all these years? He remembered her last words from that morning practice as he stole the ball. "Mr. Jordan, a promise isn't always about what you say you'll do, who you become while retaining it." Michael grabbed the lost bowl and ran down court. The crowd was loud, yet he could still hear Mrs. Thompson instructing him about angles, physics and life. With the shot clock ticking down and his teammates covered, Michael grinned. He knew what to do. He had a commitment to honor. Michael looked around at the court. 3 defenders, 5 seconds on the shot clock, and the weight of the world on his shoulders. But in his mind, he was back in that high school gym, with Mrs. Thompson's voice guiding him. She advised him to think of numerous defenders as crossing lines on a coordinate plane, always a path across junctions. You must discover it. Michael switched the bowl at 45 degrees. As the first defender approached from the left, "Basketball is poetry written in numbers," Mrs. Thompson observed one morning, watching him practice this move. "Each step is a word, each play a verse, and the game itself is your story." The second defender rushed to cut him. Michael spun right, using the momentum he'd learned to calculate years earlier. His body remembered every equation, angle, and mathematical truth Mrs. Thompson had taught him. But as he approached the third defender, something strange happened. His mind switched to a memory he'd tried to forget. The day after he became JV team captain, he arrived at the gym early to present Mrs. Thompson his new jersey, but he discovered a substitute teacher in her classroom. "Mrs. Thompson is taking some time off treatment," the principal told him later that day. That sterile word meant something was seriously wrong. For 2 weeks, he'd shown up at 5:55 a.m. anyway, practicing alone, solving geometry problems between shots. Then one morning, she was back, thinner, paler, but her eyes still blazed with determination. "Were your calculations maintained?" she inquired, like if she'd never been gone. He showed her his notebook of mathematics and gun trajectories he'd calculated. She smiled proudly, yet was crying. "Don't you need me anymore, Mr. Jordan?" "That's not true," he said. "I'll always need you." She wrote something in her notebook, the same paper she was holding in the stands, with her red pen, the same one she used to grade his first geometry test. Michael realized, confronting the last defender in the present, that Mrs. Thompson had taught him more than basketball: how to study, solve difficulties, and overcome inconceivable obstacles. Michael heard Mrs. Thompson's voice, as if she were standing next to him. "When there's no clear solution, Mr. Jordan, change your perspective. Consider the issue from a distance." The crossover dribble, slight push and step back were lines in Mrs. Thompson's geometry, forming a legendary shape. As he rose for the shot, time stopped. He saw Mrs. Thompson in the stands, holding that folded paper. The ball left his hands at the exact angle she'd calculated 20 years earlier, and Michael remembered their final complete chat before graduation. As it spun through the air, "Basketball won't last forever," she assured him, her voice softer but her spirit strong. But what you've learned about angles, problem solving, and yourself, that will stay with you long after your last game. How do you know this won't be my peak? He questioned, worrying about the future. How can you have such confidence? She gave him the folded paper and told him not to open it until he understood. While the ball was still in the air, Michael recalled witnessing his first flawless fadeaway with Mrs. Thompson, her red pen writing equations in her notebook. She had told him that day, "You have to believe before you can see them." The crowd held its breath as the ball reached its peak, and Michael Jordan realized what Mrs. Thompson had known all along. This wasn't about winning a game, but about keeping a promise he'd made 20 years earlier to himself and her. The ball fell toward the basket, carrying 2 decades of teachings, computations, and one geometry teacher's unflinching faith in a high school dropout. Phil Jackson was already standing from the bench. They all knew what would happen. Mrs. Thompson's estimates were always right. Bulls 85, Jazz 83. 20 seconds remaining. The ball went over the net with a gentle swish, causing the audience to moan and applaud. Michael didn't care about the score. He was staring at Mrs. Thompson, who was clutching the folded paper with quivering hands, the same paper she'd given him on graduation day, still in his North Carolina bedside drawer. As his teammates celebrated, he remembered the hot June afternoon in 1981, when he was looking for Mrs. Thompson among the proud parents and beaming teachers. He found her alone in room 234, where everything had started. "I wasn't sure you'd come by," she said, glancing up from her desk. She was thinner, her once dark hair gray, and the treatments had taken their toll, but her eyes still sparkled. "Are you kidding? I wouldn't be here without you," said young Michael. She grinned and reached into her desk drawer. "I have something for you, but you have to make me a promise." The clean white paper she drew out folded into perfect triangles. As usual, mathematical accuracy. "Don't open this," she urged, "until you get what I've been teaching you about geometry." Shaking her head. "About life." Young Michael took the paper, bewildered. "When will I know?" "You'll know." She rose up slowly, bracing herself on the desk, "because when that moment comes, you'll be ready to make the shot that matters most." "But I've made lots of important shots," he said, "game winners even." "This will be different," she remarked. "Not only about winning. All our efforts and struggles will be remembered. You'll feel that moment in your spirit." Michael felt it on the Utah court, the moment she'd been talking about. As his teammates went to the bench, Michael looked back at section 113 and saw Miss Thompson writing something new in her notepad, just like she did in the mornings. He remembered one of their last practice sessions, when he was enraged after learning about her sickness and missed shots. Why did you help me when you were sick when you should have rested?" he questioned after another miss. She dropped her notepad and stared at him. "Because, Mr. Jordan, some lessons are worth any sacrifice." "Why me?" "Because you weren't just learning basketball," she explained. "You were learning how to turn failure into formula, disappointment into data, setbacks into solutions. And someday, you're going to teach that lesson to the world." Michael's thoughts was still in that high school arena, when Phil Jackson planned the last defensive play. Mrs. Thompson said, "When you do open this, remember that numbers don't just tell us where we are, they tell us where we're going." After years of taking notes, he was now understanding what she meant as he watched her in the stands. The Jazz needed 2 points to tie, 3 to win, and everyone in the arena knew they would try to get the ball to Karl Malone. Michael got into his defensive stance, but his thoughts were racing. What was in that letter? What had Mrs. Thompson known 20 years ago, that he was only now understanding? Stockton passed to Malone. As the shot clock crept down, Michael saw the play unfold slowly, like one of Mrs. Thompson's geometry problems. She once told him, Basketball is like life. The solution is always there, just know where to look. Michael realized what he had to do as Malone turned to make his move, not only for the game, but for the promise he'd made in room 234 years before, which Mrs. Thompson had honored through illness, treatments, and 20 years of waiting for this day. He approached Malone, calculating angles and trajectories as she taught him, but this wasn't about math anymore. This was about completing the lesson that had begun on that autumn day, when a sophomore boy, crushed by failure, wandered into a geometry classroom and found something more valuable than a varsity spot. Malone held the ball, and Michael's muscles strained, ready to move. Mrs. Thompson closed her notepad and grinned in the stands, knowing what was coming 20 years earlier. Time seemed to pause in the single second before Michael made his move. Karl Malone had the ball, but Michael saw every daily practice, geometry lecture, and calculation Mrs. Thompson had ever taught him, all leading up to this moment. Remember, she said, every action has an equal and opposite not only physics, Mr. Jordan, that's life. The ball slipped from Malone's grasp as anticipated by the calculations as Michael's hand shot out. 20 years of math for this flawless bargain. The crowd gasped and his teammates cheered, but Michael only heard Mrs. Thompson's voice from that last morning practice, when she hardly could hold her notepad. Promise me, she urged, that you won't just shoot when your time comes. Reasons for producing it will become clear. Young Michael nodded, confused. I promise. He realized as he dribbled down court, in the last seconds, that this wasn't just about winning a title, but about finishing a lesson from room 234 20 years before. Michael imagined returning to that silent gym at 5:55 a.m. with Mrs. Thompson's red pen, while the Jazz defenders struggled to recover. Brian Russell was close behind, writing figures in her notepad. Life will push you, she informed him, like defenders. In one of their last sessions, Mrs. Thompson predicted, someday, you'll face a defender who thinks they know what you're going to do. You'll apply all you've learned then, not only the motions, but why. Michael crossed over to his right. Russell bit on the fake, just like the equation said. Basic geometry, a body in motion tends to stay in motion. The slight push, the step back, the gather, each movement precisely calculated, just as Mrs. Thompson had taught him. But this time, Michael wasn't thinking about angles or trajectories. Michael turned toward section 113. As he rose for the shot, Mrs. Thompson was standing with that folded paper in her hands, and he could see tears in her eyes. In that frozen moment, Michael understood what was written on that paper. He didn't need to open his copy back home. He knew it wasn't just calculations or predictions about his future success. It was something much more important. The ball reached its peak. Mrs. Thompson had taught him that life, like geometry, was about finding the right angles, turning obstacles into opportunities, and seeing patterns where others saw problems. The ball began its descent. Michael ran past his teammates, reporters, and everyone to section 113, row 22, because he finally understood what Mrs. Thompson had been teaching him all along. It was never about the shot. This was about converting disappointment into resolve, loss into data, and failure into math. Thompson waited for him in the stands, crying and holding that folded paper. You finally understood, she whispered. Michael nodded, crying. Why didn't you tell me sooner?